So in this mini lecture, we're interested in looking again at the purposes of education and you finding your space there and where you're positioned. What aspect of education policy are you interested in? And if you have an idea and a connection to all the different intertwined purposes of education, I think you're obviously in a better position because, as I said earlier, the interest in policy is in devising a desired human subjectivity. And then you're not doing it all on your own. The beauty is that we have wonderful thinkers and we have a long legacy of education policy researchers around the world, and you can draw from their material. I like coming at it from an eclectic mix of theorists, and I like using an eclectic mix for each of my studies, using the guidance of Murphy and Costa to devise a hybrid theoretical framework, to pull it down over the policy I'm analysing and then see what I find. And share with the reader where I'm coming from. So through historical times, I suppose, education as a system, as we know going back in history, it was set up to discipline people, to bring people in to the factories around the time of the Industrial Revolution, to have them behave themselves and to discipline them to work along the factory lines without causing problems and to work standing up for hours along the factory lines. So there's a huge regulatory piece in education. It's not just about instruction. It's not just about excellence in teaching and instruction. It is very strongly connected to a subjectivity and subjectification and regulation. And it is imbued strongly now with law and statute as well. If you're seen to be not compliant to the standards in Ireland, for example, with the Teaching Council, you can be struck off the register. So it is an ideological apparatus going alongside a repressive apparatus. So there's been a number of multiple purposes then for education. Its main aim there could be socialise you into the existing society, into the social order, to replicate society and culture. And in that way, you're actually, without thinking, you're replicating, of course, advantage and disadvantage. So socialisation is induction into the existing social order, whereas obviously activism and activist thinking with a critical consciousness is about making the world a better place. So having the openness for a practice of freedom and emancipatory possibility. And that would be developing that critical social conscience and as well as that, a critical ecological conscience as well. So is it training people for the world of work, the pipeline of talent, the qualification they need, the attitude, skills and values they need for the world of work today? That has been a predominant feature in a neoliberal world, particularly since the turn of this century, a neoliberal imaginary that has tucked in and triangulated itself with a new conservatism and a new approach there, I suppose, through patriarchy and conservatism. It has all tucked its way in and really strongly influenced education. So it's very predominantly about the pipeline of talent, the primacy of the economy and national security. And it's less about the development of the person as a person in their own right or as a person who's an activist citizen interested in the public good, or what we call in Ireland the common good of society, community building and all of that. That's very strong in our Celtic spirituality and in the way we have a historical understanding of who we are as Irish people in the world. Peace-loving and there because of a long history of colonisation and domination. So that developing the individual potential, making a fair and just society, all of those are purposes of education. And Biesta has written a great paper there that you can actually see. So mostly, if you look at what's going on in terms of policy and you look at the headings there and the outcomes-driven system, you'll see it's mostly connected with qualification and socialisation up until now, particularly since the turn of the century. And I said to you earlier, the smart student, the smart teacher, even the smart city is what's been required. And SMART means self-regulating, you're motivated, you're adaptive, you're resilient, and you have tech savvy. So that's what's required. And Lee and Lee do a very good paper on that, showing how, in fact, as people, we've nearly become microchipped in that space. And so we're not seeing ourselves as humans in relation with others, humans, non-humans, with the world, with technology, with care of the planet, and with all the other things, as a human, as human society, and as humans in relation with others and living on the planet. So then, I suppose, with the positioning of the world we're in at the moment, Biesta and Haraway and others talk about the need to actually bring the human subject to the heart of it. And then that human subjectification need is all about what kind of young person we want to emerge from the education system as we knock on their door and we say, invite them out. What kind of ethical person do we want to pull into the world today and bring into a changing democratic society? And how do we look after mind, body, spirit, a holistic education that gives people that chance to be themselves, to unplug from the world, to be reflective, to take their time, to be able to think, but to be able to think with scholarship. So to know what's actually happening in the world, to be able to give a critique of it, to have an affirmative critique, and that is concerned with the interest in making it a better world. And that makes plenty of sense inside the education policy. So, for example, Jim Hordern, working at the University of Bath, talks about the different knowledges that are needed for a teacher. The values, the skills, the beliefs, the attitudes, and the knowledge needed now for doing a highly advanced professional practice. And connected to what I've been saying about Biesta and the purposes of education, it means that educators have always had a foundational studies. In other words, it's not only the sciences, but we need the arts and humanities, because the sciences help us make sense of something. The arts and humanities help us to make the familiar strange, to think again, to open our minds, to say, are we doing it right, to ask key questions, and to keep that openness around how the world is developing and how we're developing. And also the deliberative traditions help us to ground ourselves in a personhood that has values and ethical qualities and is an inside-out professional as opposed to an outside-in. It's not simply being given values by the Teaching Council or by the United Nations Sustainable Goals or from anyone else. It's actually being able to interact with them and do the ethical journey that you need to do yourself to become that human being. So therefore the arts, ethics, aesthetics, sciences, all of that is in the field of education. So that's why education policy studies are so interesting, because they're transdisciplinary and multidisciplinary as a field. And I've just given you an introduction here to all the wonderful theorists and thinkers that we can draw from. Now, they come from schools such as critical pedagogy, they come from post-colonial studies, they're French intellectuals, they come from critical and feminist thinkers, and they come from policy, people interested in social policy, public policy, all to do with education. So these are stepping stones in to actually philosophers and sociology people, and particularly the sociologists of education. I can maybe mention there Henry Giroux. Henry is a professor in McMaster University in Canada. He has written quite a lot, as well as Peter McLaren, on the work of Paulo Freire from the 1970s, and brings in that critical pedagogy approach to it. You're also looking at others such as Stephen Ball and Meg Maguire and others from the Institute of Education in London, and they have a huge amount of theory and research left for us in terms of this policy space. And that particular research comes again from looking from, I suppose, the work of Michel Foucault, the French intellectual, from being able to actually look at education with the arts, the humanities, with a different eye, to be able to examine it and to debunk as well as look at what's needed nowadays. And then we have, for example, Pierre Bourdieu, the French intellectual, who has actually looked at the neoliberal world we're in and looked at how do we actually fire out of that. Never mind firing back, how do we fire out of it, out of its clutches? And how do we do that through the process of education? So that gives you some theorists to actually tap into to be able to frame your study.